One night, while browsing the dark web in search of information about cybersecurity, Lucas, a curious programmer, came across a link unlike anything he had ever seen. The title? Hidden Files Restricted Access. When he opened the link, he was taken to a website that displays valid documents completed by a government agency. As he scrolled down the page, he saw that he was faced with frightening information. Missing people, secret surveillance, experiments in unknown locations. What was supposed to be just an ordinary night turned into a nightmare. Now, Lucas has not only uncovered dangerous secrets, but also discovered that someone is watching him, and that they will do anything to keep those secrets buried. Welcome to the channel where every story could be the last. Here we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories. If you like to feel that chill down your spine, subscribe now, activate the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next story could be yours. The discovery of the archives. Lucas was a talented programmer, and, like many technology enthusiasts, he had a habit of exploring the darkest areas of the internet in search of knowledge. On an ordinary night, he was on dark web forums related to cybersecurity when he noticed something strange. A link with no description, marked with just a simple title, Hidden Files Restricted Access. Curiosity was stronger than common sense, and he clicked. The screen went dark, and a sequence of codes appeared, as if hacking into a protected system. After a few seconds, Lucas was redirected to a page that looked like something out of a spy movie. At the top of the page there was a warning in red letters: unauthorized access, classified. Despite the warning, he began exploring the page and soon realized that he was facing something quite serious. The documents showed records of disappearances, secret experiments, and covert operations carried out under the command of an agency identified only as AOS. The files indicated that the AOS maintained a clandestine surveillance network that monitored ordinary citizens. But what caught his attention most was a familiar name on a list of the missing: Pedro Campos, an old college classmate who disappeared a few years ago without leaving a trace. Intrigued, Lucas went deep into the archives, downloading documents and copying information. The more I discovered, the clearer it became that AOS carried out illegal operations, manipulating data and silencing those who knew too much. Fear began to take over, but he couldn't stop. He was determined to find out what had happened to Pedro and the other missing people. Suddenly, an alert appeared on his screen: "You have been identified. Stop now." Lucas's heart quickened, but he ignored the warning and continued reading. But the next alert was far more disturbing: "We are monitoring you." Quickly turning off the computer, he visualizes how real the situation was. This was not an online adventure. Now he had caught the attention of a secret agency, and they knew exactly where to find him. The next day, Lucas agreed with a weight on his mind, as if the fear from the night before had infiltrated his thoughts. Trying to convince himself that it was all just a joke or a generic warning, he went to check the computer. When turned on, the screen flashed with an unexpected message: "Be warned. The next step will be one last chance." Lucas felt his stomach turn. He tried to understand how he could have hacked into his personal system. He had taken every precaution to ensure his anonymity. The feeling of paranoia increased when he discovered that someone was watching. At work, he tried to act normally, but the apprehension was visible. At lunchtime, he saw something strange around him. Two men with discreet attire and dark glasses were sitting at a table in the background, and every time he looked, he saw the look in their eyes. He felt a chill when he noticed that one of the men was wearing a headset, as if he were in constant communication. What once seemed like paranoia has now become reality. Upon returning home, Lucas realized that someone had been there in his absence. His work files, neatly organized on his desk, were out of place. There was a letter, purposely placed on top of the keyboard: "Stop now or face the consequences." He knew he should stop, but his curiosity and desire to expose AOS were stronger. Before going to sleep, he looked through the files they had copied and found a document titled PS Experiment Confidential Report. The content was obscure and included details about psychological monitoring, experiments with manipulation, and even the creation of disappearing situations for subjects who were over-discovered. The mention of these situations made his blood run cold, and he discovered that stories about disappearances of people close to him could be directly linked to the agency. His cell phone suddenly rang. When he answered, a cold and monotonous voice said, "You had your chance. From now on, every step you will be accompanied. Choose well, Lucas. Our patience has run out." Before I could respond, the call dropped, leaving him in terrifying silence. Deep down, Lucas knew he was in danger. He decided that if he was going to continue, he would have to find a way to protect it, and quickly. Lucas spent a sleepless night with a mind full of paranoia. Every noise felt like a threat, every shadow an ominous presence. The next morning I made a decision, to expose what I knew. He spent the day transferring the files to multiple devices and created a strategy to disseminate the information en masse. But, on the way to work we discovered that we were being followed. First, a black car followed him from a distance, but every time he changed direction, the car reappeared at another point. He then decided to walk to lose them, but as he crossed a park, he saw that it wasn't just a vehicle following him. Two men in dark suits stood nearby, maintaining a strategic distance. Every movement was controlled. He knew that any false step could be his last. The panic grew when I received another message on my cell phone, this time without sending. "You are overstepping your limits. This is the last warning." When he looked back, he saw one of the men approaching with his cell phone to his ear. He was being monitored in real time, and any escape attempts were thwarted. Lucas decided to take a risk and entered an office building, trying to lose his pursuers. He quickly went up the stairs and hid on the top floor. Inside a small, empty office, I tried to send a message to a journalist friend, known for investigating reports of dangers. But the cell phone signal was blocked. Fear grew in his mind, and he finally understood that AOS had complete control over the situation. After a few minutes, he heard firm, steady footsteps down the hall. He held his breath, trying his best not to make any noise. The office door was ajar, and Lucas saw a shadow slowly pass through the crack. He felt his heart racing and kept his eyes fixed on the door, trying not to blink. The figure stopped in front of the door, and for an instant, Lucas knew he had been discovered. But the footsteps continued, disappearing at the end of the corridor. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he took his flash drive with the files and hid it in the lining of his pants, so that it wouldn't be confiscated if he was caught. In absolute silence, he left the office and managed to escape the building. But he knew that from that moment on, the AOS was no longer just monitoring him. They were prepared to do whatever it took to silence him, and Lucas was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. With the flash drive hidden, Lucas decided his only chance was to expose AOS before it was too late. Desperate, he showed up at Dan's house, his trusted journalist friend, and explained the entire situation, detailing the threats, persecution, and the reserved files. Dan, skeptical at first, fell silent upon viewing the documents, finally understanding the gravity of what Lucas had discovered. "This information is explosive," Dan muttered, examining one of the documents about disappearances covered up by the agency. "But if they are who you say they are, we have to be careful. We need irrefutable evidence to launch a complaint." However, while we were planning the next step, Dan's cell phone started vibrating with strange messages. An unknown number sent a single warning repeatedly: "You're getting too involved, Dan. Stop now." They both looked at each other, and Dan quickly turned off his cell phone. But fear had already crept in. They knew they were no longer safe. Lucas and Dan decided to act on the same night. With the flash drive protected, they went to the newspaper where Dan worked, a safer place to publish a report. They crossed the city, trying to move discreetly, but soon realized they were being followed again. Cars without license plates appeared in indexes, and shadowy figures monitored their steps at every corner. Inside the newspaper office, Dan prepared the material for publication, while Lucas remained alert, looking out the window. It was then that the newsroom phone rang. Dan hesitated but answered. "You have already gone too far. Last chance. Abandon the files and erase any trace." The cold, metallic voice was unmistakable. Alice was one step ahead, again. Determined to move forward, Dan ignored the threat and continued his work. Just as I was about to publish the article, the power to the building went out. The lights went out, and silence was necessary due to the fear of taking over the environment. Lucas looked at Dan, tension clear in his eyes. Suddenly, the office door was broken down, and men dressed in black invaded the place. With no time to react, Lucas and Dan were surrendered, documents confiscated, and all material destroyed. As they are taken outside, Lucas discovers that everything he tried to do to expose the truth had been in vain. AOS had overcome them, using his power and control to protect the dark secrets he carried. He saw his flash drive being crushed and destroyed, and any hope of revealing the truth was dashed. When they got them into a van, Lucas and Dan exchanged one last look. They knew they were just two names in a long list of people who discovered too much. In the end, AOS made sure to keep its secrets buried, and they would never be seen again. Lucas and Dan were sitting side by side on cold, uncomfortable metal chairs. The environment was a dark, windowless room, lit only by a fluorescent lamp that wavered above their heads. The only exit was a reinforced steel door, which made a locking sound every time one of the agents entered. Lucas's eyes were fixed on the ground, trying to understand what was coming, while Dan, with his hands attached to a metal bar, stared into space. Suddenly, the door opened, and a tall man with an impeccable uniform and a cold expression entered the room. He carried a clipboard and showed no emotion. The agents accompanying him positioned themselves next to Lucas and Dan, creating an atmosphere of oppression and fear. "Do you think you understand what you are doing? They're about to discover how things really work," said the man in a low, controlled voice. Without giving them time to respond, he placed the clipboard on the table and leaned over, fixing his gaze on Lucas. "Where are the files?" Lucas was silent, but his entire body tensed. He knew that any wrong answer could cost him his life. "You think you can play with us, but we know everything. We know where your families are, where you usually go, and who your friends are," the agent continued calmly as he leafed through the notes on his clipboard. He gestured, and another agent brought a metal box and placed it on the table. The box was opened, revealing a variety of tools, not for physical torture, but for interrogation without leaving a trace. There were electrodes, devices to induce mental pressure, and some unknown medications. Dan tried to look brave, but the tension was visible on his face. When the agent moved, he tried to argue. "You can't do that. There are laws and we have rights." The man laughed, a cold, dry laugh. "Laws? Rights? You have crossed the line by touching information that does not concern you. What we do here will never leave this room." Lucas felt his stomach turn as the agent held one of the electrodes, connecting it to the device. Without further warning, he applied it to Dan's arm. The electric current coursed through his body, and he was engulfed in agony. The pain was intense, and Lucas tried desperately to look away, but his friend's screams echoed through the room, impossible to ignore. The agents supported the interrogation, alternating between Lucas and Dan, increasing the intensity of the psychological and physical pressure. Each time one of them resisted, a new wave of torture was applied. The objective was clear: to get them to hand over any copy of the files. After endless hours, Lucas was exhausted and bruised, while Dan could barely keep his eyes open. The threat was burned into their minds. They knew that if they did not cooperate, their lives would be erased, as would those who wished to expose too many secrets. The interrogation session continued, and this time the agents increased the level of threats. They brought details of their personal lives, describing precisely where Lucas and Dan lived, who they interacted with, and the times of their routines. Every detail was mentioned with frightening coldness, making it clear that no place was beyond AOS's reach. The leader of the operation, the same agent who started the interrogation, moved away from Lucas once again, with a determined look in his eyes. "Here's what's going to happen," he said in a tone that left no room for discussion. "You have two choices: give us everything, including anyone who received a copy of the files, or go to a place where no one will ever find them." Lucas looked at Dan, who was trying to focus despite the pain and fatigue. They both knew they could not give in without condemning other innocent people. But the threat was real and there was no way out. Lucas tried to respond, but his voice was weak and he just shook his head, refusing to budge. The answer irritated the agent, who hit the table hard. "You don't understand the gravity of the situation," he remembered. "Every minute you resist forces us to make your lives more miserable. And this is just the beginning." They were taken to another room, where agents strapped them into reinforced metal chairs and attached sensors to their wrists and heads designed to detect any emotional or physiological changes. Thus, any sign of resistance was identified instantly, resulting in new doses of shocks. Hours passed. Exhausted, they were both close to their limit. The threats continued, and Lucas knew that giving in was the only way to end the suffering. He turned to Dan, looking panicked, trying to understand if there was still some kind of hope. It was then that the leader of the operation moved again, this time with a proposal. "Last offer. If you hand over the files and agree to a confidentiality agreement, we will allow you to live in peace. Deny it, the next person we meet will be one of your loved ones." Lucas and Dan looked at each other, and with one last effort, they knew they had to make the most difficult decision of their lives. After a final round of threats and torture, Lucas and Dan had no choice but to give in. In an act of desperation, they handed over what was left of the files, giving AOS control over everything they had discovered. Tired and defeated, they agreed to the confidentiality agreement that prohibited them from sharing any information about what they had experienced. Finally, they were escorted out of the building and thrown into a black van, still not knowing if they really were free or if it was just another veiled threat. The silence was suffocating, and they only exchanged looks of tiredness and resignation. Each wondered if they would return home or disappear forever like others before them. After a long journey in silence, a van stopped at a familiar place. Lucas was left in front of his building, staring at the ground as agents watched his every move. Without a word, he entered the house, exhausted, and felt the weight of what he had been through come crashing down on his shoulders. He tried to live normally over the next few days, but something had changed. Whenever he went out for a walk, he felt eyes on him as if he was constantly being watched. He avoided talking about what would happen even with Dan, afraid that one slip-up would put them both in danger again. One night, Lucas received a last message on his cell phone from an anonymous number. "Forget everything you saw. His life goes on, but we will be watching. Remember, you will never be completely free." From that day on, Lucas knew that his life would never be the same. He knew that any attempt to challenge the AOS would be his end. He returned to his routine, remaining discreet, but the feeling of being monitored never isolated. Suspicious looks on the street, anonymous messages and constant fear were the price he paid for getting too close to the truth. Lucas and Dan continued their lives, but they both carried a dark secret, knowing that AOS would watch over them forever. Did you like this story? I left another scary story here on the card. Click on it. Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Share your story in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of your story together.